So I ran into an old acquaintance yesterday at the supermarket. We hadn't seen each other in maybe 6 months. Anyway, he was super friendly, big smile, and hits me with that totally standard question. So how are you lately? Oh, and my brain just like stopped, froze, complete stall. And then it starts racing, right? Try to figure out the query. What does lately mean? Is that the last 6 months, last week, since I woke up? And how? What part of how? My job, my health. Is he asking about my cat being sick? Does he really want to know all that? Or is it just, the thing you say? By the time my brain cycled through all of that, the silence just stretched. Maybe 3 seconds. Felt like forever. I finally just managed. Fine, you. And he gives me that little tight-lipped smile, the one that kind of screams, okay, you're a bit weird. And they just, moved on. It's an interaction or something like it that's happened to me basically my whole life. That simple question seems like background noise for most people, but for me, it feels like this impossible logic puzzle I'm designed to fail. People call it not reading the air. But what if you're just...
It's not built for that. What if your brain focuses on all the tiny details but just completely misses the unwritten social script everyone else seems to have?
Yeah, that little story, it really kind of sums up what we're diving into today. Just how hard it can be to navigate social stuff when you're not wired for all that implicit unspoken communication, which often applies to people with neurodevelopmental differences like ASD or ADHD. So today we're taking a wider look, a global view, really. We're going to investigate the specific, sometimes really overwhelming challenges faced in what they call high-context societies, like Japan, where social harmony is just everything. Then we'll pivot. We'll look at the intense psychological stuff, the emotional roller coaster that adults go through when they finally get a diagnosis late in life, after spending decades just trying to push through. And finally, we're shifting completely towards solutions. We'll explore some really innovative evidence-based strategies, things that actually leverage the unique strengths of neurodivergent folks, like hyper-focus on those intense special interests, to really drive success, both academically and personally.
And that's such a critical point. The problem isn't always with the person, right? Often it's the system they're trying to navigate. If the environment demands, absolute conformity and that everyone just gets the unspoken rules, well, someone wired for logic, for explicit communication, they're facing this huge invisible barrier. It causes immense stress, exclusion, really. So let's start there. Let's examine those invisible walls, which seem particularly high in certain cultural settings.
Okay, so when we even start talking about neurodevelopmental differences, autism, ADHD, all that, we have to admit something pretty fundamental about where our knowledge comes from. Almost all the research, right?
Yeah.
The criteria we use, the diagnostic manuals, even just the general public understanding, it mostly comes from studies done in Western societies, the US, Europe, Australia.
Yeah, and that Western focus, it creates this massive, honestly, kind of dangerous research gap globally. We just don't have enough solid data to say for sure if the experiences, the actual issues, the support needs of autistic people in non-Western cultures are the same or similar, or maybe completely different, because the environment, the culture, it radically changes how neurodivergence shows up and definitely changes the challenges people face.
And that research gap feels like a huge flashing red light the second you compare basic cultural values. The whole individualistic West versus collectivist East Asia, like Japan. It's not just about table manners, is it? Yeah. It's the whole operating system for social life.
Oh, absolutely. It changes everything, especially the expectations on the individual. Personal ambition versus making sure the group is okay. Western societies, let's say the US, they tend to really prioritize the self. Individuality, being self-reliant, achieving things people can see. But in many East Asian societies, Japan included, the emphasis is way more on conformity, social harmony, this idea of harmonious interdependence. The main thing is fitting in smoothly with the group. Your value is tied to how well you maintain that group cohesion.
And you see these differences pop up in ways that seem small, but are actually really powerful, like how people think about friendship. I remember reading about that study comparing students. In the US, they valued friendships that were active and energetic, very individual, very expressive.
Right, but the Japanese students, they prioritized comfort in friendships, which really reflects that cultural tendency to avoid uncertainty. They want stability, no friction, no conflict if possible.
And that desire for stability, for no conflict, it gets baked into the system, right? Into these really strong hierarchies, especially at work. And this is where things can get incredibly difficult for a neurodivergent employee.
Exactly. There's data showing this huge difference in attitudes towards authority. Like over 70% of senior managers in East Asia said they valued absolute obedience to supervisors. 70%.
Wow.
Now compare that to the US managers. Only about 30% agreed with that.
That's a massive difference, over double. A 40-point gap in valuing strict obedience.
Yeah.
That's not just theoretical. That must translate into serious day-to-day pressure if you're an employee who needs things spelled out, who maybe doesn't pick up on the unspoken chain of command stuff.
Precisely. Think about it. If you're in a system where 7 out of 10 bosses value absolute obedience above all else, and you need to ask for an accommodation, maybe different lighting or noise-canceling headphones, or just, hey, can you please write those instructions down for me? That request might not be seen as you asking for a tool you need to do your job well. It could easily be interpreted as, well, as insubordination, as fundamentally disrupting the harmony, the hierarchy. The neurotypical employee might somehow sense the right moment to ask, or the perfectly deferential way to phrase it. But for someone who operates on explicit logic, that simple request can suddenly become a huge misstep in that kind of high obedience culture.
Which leads us right into the core challenge, implicit communication. It's the foundation of these high-context cultures. So if you're not supposed to be explicit, how on earth do you communicate your needs, or even just get through the day?
Well, that's the thing. In a collectivistic, high-context place like Japan, communication is just loaded with implicit meaning. The actual words spoken, the low-context message, they often matter less than the shared background, the history between people, the nonverbal cues. This is reading the atmosphere, or kukiyomanai, as they say, being KY. And direct, explicit communication, the kind that provides clarity for many neurodivergent people, is often linked with individualism. So it can come across as rude, maybe disruptive, or just socially clumsy.
So, okay, an autistic person whose brain is already working overtime trying to decode implicit stuff, body language, tone, all those unwritten rules, is now dropped into an environment where most of the vital information is implicit. That sounds like an exponential increase in the mental effort needed just to exist.
It really is. And then it gets even trickier. Because some behaviors that we might see as diagnostic markers in the West, they're just normal cultural practices in Japan, which creates this extra layer of confusion. It can mask real differences. Take eye contact, for example. In Japan, generally, there's less direct eye contact compared to many Western cultures. It's just the norm. Or greetings. People bow. They don't usually shake hands. So that removes a whole layer of physical, social interaction that, say, Americans might rely on for cues.
That's a really crucial point. Something that might get flagged immediately in, a clinic in London or New York as markedly impaired social interaction. It could just be seen as typical Japanese behavior, which must make diagnosis way harder, especially maybe for women or people who are already good at masking. The culture kind of accidentally normalizes some differences while maybe intensely stigmatizing others.
And that intense stigma, unfortunately, is pretty well documented. There was one study comparing attitudes. It found American students were generally more willing to engage with autistic individuals. Japanese students, though, showed greater social distance. They preferred to keep more space. And here's the kicker. That distance remained even after both groups took an online course designed to increase understanding of autism. Education alone didn't erase it. It suggests the stigma isn't just lack of information. It might be, more deeply embedded in the cultural fabric somehow.
And does that resistance, that stigma, extend beyond autism?
Yeah.
Like to disability more generally?
It seems to, yeah. If you look at views on mental illness, the contrast is quite stark. Japanese people, for instance, were found to be significantly more likely than British people to think individuals with conditions like schizophrenia are dangerous or abnormal.
Yeah.
And they showed a really strong preference for institutionalization over community inclusion. Just to give you a number, in one study, only 26% of Japanese respondents agreed that people experiencing delusions should live in the community without being hospitalized. That level of preference for keeping people separate, that fear of difference, it creates a very challenging, very high-stakes environment for anyone whose brain works differently.
Wow. And thinking about autistic women in that kind of society, the pressure to maintain that social harmony, to fit in, must be absolute relentless. I've heard the term over-adaptation used.
Yes, the expectations can become extreme, especially for women who are often culturally expected to kind of manage the emotional temperature of the group, Autistic women in the research talked about this intense pressure to read the atmosphere, constantly trying to avoid being disruptive. One person said they felt they just couldn't do it well enough. She said, "I'm always putting on a mask, but I can never be a truly good girl." It's this state of constant high alert. It forces them into what we call over-adaptation. They pour massive amounts of internal energy into just mimicking compliance and normalcy on the outside.
That sounds exhausting.
Yeah.
And the tragedy is, even if it works on the surface, even if it reduces friction with the group, it's got to be incredibly costly internally, leading to stress, anxiety, burnout.
Totally. It's a really toxic trade-off. They want connection, but the way they're forced to try and achieve it is basically self-destructive. And these cultural pressures, they don't just stay personal, they bleed directly into professional life. We see systemic resistance there, not really genuine attempts to accommodate difference. The employment stats alone are pretty concerning. Around the time of the research we looked at, only about 29% of people with developmental disabilities were employed in Japan.
Oh.
That's really low.
Okay.
It's just the system is failing to integrate them.
And then we have that story you mentioned, Tagi's story, an employee diagnosed with ASD and ADHD who actually tried to use the system, the law, as intended.
Yeah, Daiki's account is incredibly revealing about these structural hurdles. Japan introduced an anti-discrimination law in 2016, so he disclosed his diagnoses and requested reasonable accommodations under that law. The company's response wasn't just no, it was an attack on the nature of his condition. They told him he was not allowed to apply for accommodations and that he should only come back after he had recovered so that I could work as a normal person. He had to explain over and over that ASD and ADHD aren't temporary illnesses you recover from. They're neurological differences.
That is just staggering. The cruelty, but also the sheer absurdity of telling someone their neurology needs to recover. It really shows this deep, maybe fundamental cultural resistance to adapting. They didn't want to change the environment. They wanted him to change his brain wiring.
They basically just wanted him to train in the areas that I have trouble with, which isn't support, right? It's a demand for assimilation. And Daiki was clear. This wasn't just one bad manager. He saw it as a wider cultural issue. He described the company culture as military-like, with lots of rules. He said staff were completely controlled and that the company actively disliked people who stood out or were unusual.
Yeah.
And he explicitly linked it, saying this kind of attitude, disliking people who stand out, was really a part of Japanese culture or Japanese company culture.
Which makes the barrier systemic, not just individual bad actors. When the culture itself sees nonconformity as a kind of threat and obedience as this primary virtue, the pressure on neurodivergent individuals must feel almost impossible. And this must lead people to spend years, decades even, just trying to force themselves into a shape that fundamentally doesn't fit.
Exactly. And then when that decades-long struggle finally bumps up against a crucial piece of information, like a diagnosis, it kicks off this profound psychological chain reaction, the systemic failure we saw with Daiki. It inevitably throws the burden back onto the individual. It forces this crisis of identity. Which brings us neatly to our next section. What actually happens when all those years of masking finally collide with a late diagnosis?
Yeah, it feels like we hear about this more and more. Adults seeking diagnoses for neurodevelopmental differences, often after going through their whole lives feeling like something was just off or misunderstood. The relief of finally getting an explanation must be incredible, but it sounds like the system often drops the ball right at that critical moment.
It really does. The number of late diagnoses is definitely rising, but post-diagnostic support for adults, it's notoriously thin on the ground. In one survey we looked at, focusing on adults who'd received their diagnosis, a shocking 42% said they were offered no post-diagnostic support, none whatsoever. It's like being handed the instruction manual for your own brain, finally, but with no guidance on how to actually read it or use it.
Wow, 42% get nothing. So they're left to process this potentially life-altering information, basically on their own, or they have to find their own communities.
That's largely what happens. And the immediate emotional reaction, as you can imagine, is intense, but also really complex. It's not just one thing. On the positive side, there's often this huge wave of relief, validation. People saying things like, suddenly their whole life made sense, or the diagnosis explained why I couldn't work until now. There was one participant, Mikako, who felt so affirmed knowing her struggles weren't just my imagination. Another, Satomi, felt this immediate sense of belonging, like, okay, I fit into that category. It's that powerful shift, right? From thinking I'm flawed to realizing, oh, I'm different.
But I imagine there's a flip side to that coin, too, a painful side. Looking back, grieving maybe for the life they thought they should have had, or realizing how much social difficulty they endured for no good reason.
Absolutely. The negative emotional blowback can be severe, especially right after diagnosis. Feelings of being inferior, suddenly worrying about being discriminated against and disadvantaged, or just a profound loss of confidence. Daiki, the employee we talked about in Japan, mentioned this initial phase. He said he felt very uncomfortable with the fact that I have a disability. I thought I was not good enough. I thought I was inferior. That initial reaction, seeing yourself as broken or feeling like you've lost confidence, it's often the direct result of having soaked up all that societal stigma for decades without knowing why things were so hard. The diagnosis confirms the struggles were real, but it takes real time to integrate that knowledge without blaming yourself.
It sounds like the diagnosis isn't really an endpoint. It's more like the starting gun for this really deep, necessary process of figuring out your identity all over again.
That's exactly what the research suggests. The diagnosis acts as a catalyst for intense self-exploration. People use this new framework, this new label, to finally understand themselves better, their limits, but also their strengths. And crucially, it often gives them permission to finally stop trying so hard to pretend, to stop masking, and to start being the real me. But this isn't a quick fix. It's a fundamental identity process that unfolds not in weeks or months, but often over years.
Which brings us to some fascinating quantitative research on identity. It looked specifically at personal autistic identity, and it measured two kind of core, sometimes opposing aspects: autism pride and exclusion dissatisfaction.
Right, and the researchers initially thought, quite logically, that maybe getting diagnosed earlier in life would lead to better outcomes, a more positive identity later on. But what they found was really counterintuitive. The specific age someone was when they got diagnosed, it turned out to be insignificant. It didn't really predict whether they felt more pride or more dissatisfaction later. Didn't matter if you found out at 6 or 60.
Okay, that is surprising. So if the age you found out didn't make the difference, what did?
The critical factor was time, the amount of time that had passed since the diagnosis. The research showed a clear, measurable link. The more years that had gone by since someone received their diagnosis, the less dissatisfaction they reported feeling about being autistic. It's strong evidence that this identity development thing, integrating this new, huge piece of information into your sense of self, it's an adjustment process. It takes time and effort, regardless of when you started that journey.
That makes sense. There must be so much mental work involved. Looking back at maybe decades of struggles, relationships that didn't work out, jobs you couldn't keep, and suddenly realizing they weren't because you were lazy or bad, but because of a neurological mismatch. How long does it take to really reprocess all that history?
It's a constant reframing, isn't it? Right at first, the negative stuff, the feelings of being excluded, the sense of being deficient, the dissatisfaction that might be really strong, because it reflects finally understanding why things were so hard, why you felt different. But over time, as people learn more, maybe connect with the autistic community, do their own research, they often start shifting. They move towards seeing autism not just as a deficit, but as a positive difference. It involves letting go of all that internalized stigma, the self-blame they carried when they just thought they weren't trying hard enough or were somehow inherently bad at being human. And that shift often leads to more self-acceptance, more self-compassion.
The psychological journey makes sense, but does this shift in identity actually connect to measurable mental health outcomes? Like, is someone who feels more autism pride genuinely doing better psychologically than someone stuck feeling exclusion dissatisfaction?
Yes, emphatically yes. The quantitative results here were really strong. The study found a highly significant link. Greater autism pride strongly predicted higher self-esteem, and conversely, greater exclusion dissatisfaction strongly predicted lower self-esteem. It's a direct measure showing how that internal identity work directly impacts psychological well-being.
That feels like a massively important takeaway, especially for anyone involved in providing support. It's saying that more than how severe someone's traits are, or what age they were diagnosed, the biggest predictor of an adult's self-esteem is how they identify with being autistic right now.
That's the profound implication, exactly. If support systems truly want to improve outcomes, maybe the focus needs to shift. Less about fixing traits, more about fostering identity affirmation and pride. And there was more. The data also suggested that feeling excluded and dissatisfied was linked to poorer overall mental well-being, which fits perfectly with theories about minority stress, right? When you internalize the chronic stress that comes from stigma and discrimination, it fundamentally harms your psychological health. So the person who internalizes the stigma of being neurodivergent is likely to have worse mental health. It just reinforces how urgent it is to help people move towards an identity of pride.
Okay, but if, as you said, 42% of these adults are getting zero formal support after diagnosis, where are they learning how to do this? How to navigate this really tricky identity shift and find that self-compassion?
They're essentially building their own support networks. The data really points to this widespread reliance on self-teaching and community knowledge. So many participants reported figuring out how to cope, how to advocate for themselves, mainly by doing their own research online. And, really importantly, learning from other people online, connecting with the wider autistic community. Forums, social media groups, online meetups.
So the community itself is stepping in to fill this huge void left by the professional medical system, providing not just coping strategies, but maybe also the language, the concepts needed for self-advocacy.
It's a really powerful grassroots effect. And this self-driven learning, this community connection, it has real positive outcomes. The diagnosis gives people the clarity, right? And often the confidence they need for self-advocacy. Once they have the words, the framework to understand their own needs, they feel more empowered to actually ask for accommodations in their personal lives, at school, at work. And being able to ask for what they need, that actively starts to reduce all those negative past experiences with discrimination, with just struggling unsupported. They shift from feeling confused and like a failure towards feeling capable and self-determined.
That whole journey from potentially decades of confusion and struggle to eventually finding pride in that identity, it's incredibly inspiring. But it also really highlights the sheer resilience needed to just get by in systems that weren't designed for you. Okay, so we've looked at the cultural barriers, the personal psychological struggle. Now let's totally shift gears. Let's look towards the future. What happens when we stop trying to force the person to change and instead start leveraging their unique wiring to actually drive success?
Right, so this section flips the script entirely. We're moving from barriers to concrete interventions, specifically looking at what works in an academic setting. We're focusing on a really interesting study done in Sweden. It involved high school students diagnosed with both ASD and ADHD who were seriously at risk of failing math. And the whole foundation of the approach they used is strengths-based. It starts by recognizing that certain neurodivergent traits, if you harness them correctly, are actually huge assets.
Okay, let's talk about special interests, or SIs. Sometimes clinically, the language around them sounds a bit negative, right? Like restricted or unusually intense. But in terms of potential, what do they actually represent for motivation?
SIs are way more than just hobbies. They are interests that have this atypically intense and restricted quality. But for the neurodivergent person, they're often this incredibly powerful, almost bottomless well of intrinsic motivation. They bring genuine joy, allow for deep competence, and they serve a really vital psychological function too. They provide comfort and relief to stressors. They can be a refuge from anxiety or sensory overload.
And they're super common, right? So common that they're basically a universal resource we could potentially tap into.
Almost universal in this population, yeah. The data suggests the incidence in adolescents with ASD is incredibly high figures, range from 95% up to nearly 99.7%. So practically speaking, we're talking about a readily available high-octane motivation engine that's there, ready to be potentially harnessed for academic purposes.
And the core problem these students in the study were facing in math class was a mix of things. Low interest in the standard stuff, plus those executive function challenges.
Exactly. It's important to understand the cognitive mechanics here. Students with ASD and ADHD often struggle with key executive functions, things like working memory, planning, and especially inhibitory control. Inhibitory control is basically the brain function that lets you tune out distractions and force yourself to focus on something boring or difficult, like that standard math worksheet.
Right. So if the worksheet itself holds zero interest for you, your brain has to burn a huge amount of energy using that inhibitory control just to stay on task.
Precisely. And if you have a deficit in that area, forcing that control is either incredibly exhausting or sometimes just impossible.
Right.
So when the subject matter itself doesn't provide any intrinsic motivation, their executive function challenges basically prevent them from staying focused, from regulating their own behavior on the task, which leads to avoiding the task and high risk of failing. The question then becomes, how can we bypass the need for that really effortful inhibitory control?
And the answer the researchers came up with was ingenious. Use the motivation that's already there from the special interest and build the academic task around it, using something called an antecedent-based intervention.
That's it. It comes from applied behavior analysis, ABA, an antecedent-based intervention, or ABI. Think about the difference between an antecedent and a consequence. A consequence-based approach might be, say, giving a reward after the work is done, finish your math, then you get 15 minutes of music time. But an antecedent-based intervention manipulates the situation before the behavior happens to make the desired behavior more likely or even inevitable. In this case, your math assignment is about music.
Ah, okay. So by weaving the SI right into the assignment itself, they're basically setting the stage so that the student's natural hyperfocus, their intrinsic motivation, flows directly into the academic work.
Yes, exactly. The antecedent, the math assignment itself, gets transformed. It becomes a task the brain actually wants to engage with, and that neatly sidesteps the need for that exhausting inhibitory control that was failing them before. So the study focused on 3 high schoolers in Sweden. Let's call them Harry, Hermione, and Ron, all struggling badly with math, mainly because they just weren't staying on task. And crucially, they all shared a primary special interest: music.
And the real cleverness seems to be how deeply they customized the content. They didn't just slap a music sticker on a normal worksheet. They made the math an unavoidable part of engaging with the SI. Let's take Harry. His interest was keyboard and music generally, and he was learning geometry.
Right, so Harry got geometry problems, calculating perimeter and area, the usual stuff. But every single object was related to his passion. He wasn't finding the area of some generic rectangle. He was calculating the perimeter of a keyboard, the area of a vinyl record sleeve, the dimensions of an old cassette tape case. The actual math computations were identical, but the context completely flipped his motivational switch on.
Okay, that's cool. What about Hermione? Her SI was songwriting. How do you connect songwriting to math?
Right. That one took a bit more creative thinking. Hermione was given the task of actually writing a song about mathematics. Specifically, a song that incorporated the Fibonacci sequence. So she had to use her math skills to understand the pattern, the sequence itself, and then engage her songwriting skills, her SI, to explain that concept through lyrics. It's a brilliant example of turning something abstract into a concrete creative task that she'd be intrinsically motivated to do. She even used her guitar to compose the music, managing the whole project herself.
That's fantastic. And Ron, his passion was music production. Things like functions and graphs can feel incredibly abstract and dry.
So for Ron, they anchored all the math problems in the practical realities of music production. He worked on problems about calculating the rental costs of music studios over time, analyzing price curves for album sales in the market, figuring out the depreciation value of expensive mixing equipment. Suddenly, those abstract concepts, functions, graphs, they had a direct real-world application within his area of intense interest.
The setup sounds really solid, conceptually. But the crucial question is always, did it actually work? Did all this customization lead to real, measurable changes in their academic behavior?
The results were pretty dramatic. Academic on-task behavior shot up significantly for all 3 students when they were working on the SI-based assignments. And the statistics back it up strongly. The change wasn't just, a little bit better. It was huge. For Harry and Hermione, the effect sizes they use a measure called SM-DEL were astounding. 4.27 and 4.86.
Can you give us a sense, for people listening, what an effect size of 4 or 5 actually means, like in practical terms?
Sure. In educational research, an effect size of 0.8 is generally considered large. Anything over 1.0 means the intervention had a very strong impact. When you see numbers like 4 or 5, it basically means the intervention caused an almost complete shift in behavior. For Harry, it meant going from doing almost no work, being totally off task, to being consistently engaged and focused for pretty much the whole time he had the music math assignments. It's like scientific proof of that intrinsic motivation just taking over. Even Ron, who had more ups and downs to begin with, still showed a large effect size of 1.77.
And there was that specific part of the study with Harry, the AB-AB reversal design. That sounds like the real smoking gun, proving it was the SI content making the difference.
Yes, the reversal phase is the classic way to demonstrate causality in this kind of research. So after Harry reached that stable, high level of being on task with the music geometry, the researchers deliberately took it away. They gave him standard math work again, this time on probability. And what happened was immediate and striking. His on-task behavior just plummeted, fell straight back down to near zero within a couple of lessons. He barely completed any of the probability work, and he actually started asking for the music-related problems back.
Wow, that's incredibly powerful evidence. It shows his engagement wasn't just because it was novel, where he was getting special attention. It was the deep neurological connection to the content that was driving the focus. As soon as that intrinsic motivator was removed, the underlying executive function challenges, that difficulty forcing attention, just snapped right back.
Exactly. And there was another important improvement they noticed. During the times the students had the SI-based work, they needed significantly fewer prompts or reminders from the teacher compared to when they had the standard work, which suggests the SI wasn't just making the work more fun, it was actually helping them engage their own internal motivation, their own executive functions more effectively. They became less dependent on the teacher for external regulation. It points to a real improvement in self-regulation when the content itself was compelling.
Now, there's sometimes a worry, maybe among educators, that if you take a special interest and turn it into schoolwork, you might kind of contaminate it, like reduce the joy because now it's tied to academic pressure. Did the study see any sign of that?
Interestingly, no. Quite the opposite, actually, which is a really powerful finding for anyone thinking about using this approach. For Harry and Hermione, the two students whose size stayed consistent throughout the study, the intensity and the importance they placed on their SIs actually increased after the intervention. Harry's self-rating of his music interest went from very important before the study to the most important thing in my life afterwards. His enthusiasm score went way up too. It seems like using the interest in a successful academic context actually reinforced its positive value for them.
So instead of diluting the interest, the academic success, the feeling of competence it enabled actually boosted its importance in their identity.
It looks that way, like a positive feedback loop. Success fueled by the interest reinforced the value of the interest. Now, the case of Ron, who had slightly less dramatic results, does offer an important nuance here.
Right. What did Ron's experience tell us about how these interests work?
Well, Ron's main interest actually shifted during this study. He started out focused on music production, but by the follow-up survey, his primary passion had become transportation, particularly mountain bikes. So it's quite possible that his waning interest in music towards the end contributed to why the music-themed math intervention wasn't quite as impactful for him as for the others. It's a crucial reminder for educators. SIs aren't necessarily static. They can change, evolve, or be replaced over time. So any intervention using them needs to be flexible and keep checking in on what the student is currently passionate about.
But the big picture takeaway for educators seems crystal clear. These methods, which have worked well for younger kids with SIs, are just as powerful, maybe even more so, for teenagers in high school. Even if teachers worry about fitting it into the standard curriculum, the results here seem to overwhelmingly justify making the effort to customize.
Absolutely. It confirms that adapting the learning environment to match the student's unique wiring, literally turning their passion into part of their curriculum, is arguably the single most effective way to unlock academic engagement. Especially for students who struggle with those executive function deficits, it's a really powerful, strengths-based approach to inclusion and genuine success.
Wow. We've covered a huge amount of ground in this deep dive, haven't we? We went from looking at those really tough systemic pressures of high context communication and the demand for conformity like in Japan. Then we moved through that intense, years-long psychological journey of identity integration that happens after a late diagnosis. And we ended up with this incredibly effective evidence-based strategy of actually leveraging special interests right there in the classroom.
Yeah, and the thread connecting all of it really is the profound impact of context and recognition. In Japan, that context of implicit norms, it leads to isolation, resistance to accommodation, forcing people into constant, exhausting masking.
And then on the personal level, that journey of late diagnosis just shows how much resilience is needed, how identity becomes this self-directed project, especially when formal support is missing. And that the time spent learning to feel pride in that identity is what really predicts psychological health.
And finally, that Swedish study gives us such a clear, practical solution. When educators actually adapt the learning environment to align with how a student's brain naturally works by using that special interest, they can transform what looks like a deficit, like poor focus or control, into genuine engagement and measurable academic success.
It really makes it clear, doesn't it? The goal shouldn't be forcing people to assimilate into systems that just cause chronic stress and failure. Instead, it should be about creating systems, whether cultural, professional, or educational, that actually recognize, value, and even leverage different ways of being wired. That real success for neurodivergent individuals depends on us adapting the world to validate their unique strengths.